Everyone was like, I had no idea that Japan attacked the United States. I'm like,
Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats and your cell phones so that we can begin tonight's program. Seats and cell phones. Thank you.
Ready? You want me to, just, you can nod. You want to come up when I come up and sit down, or you want me to call it? Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Mike Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's great to have you here. Thanks for braving this weather, too. Before we launch into the program, some recognitions both for the people here but also at home that we'd like to make, and I think consistent with our mission. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors in the audience? Well, certainly there are some in the audience at home, so let's give them a round of applause. And then veterans or active duty members of our armed forces from any era, would you stand or wave and be recognized as well? Who else? Thanks for your service. Importantly, though, what the veterans do is not possible without supports from their family. And family members of any veterans or active duty service members, would you also stand or raise your hand and be recognized as well? Yeah, that's a whole bunch of you. No, thanks for that. That just not possible without that support. I'd also like to recognize our Patriot Circle and Charter members here tonight. Your support allows us really to carry out these programs, but also to get those to folks watching from home. So Patriot Circle, Charter members, how about if you stand and we can thank you as well. Now, I know we've got some relatives of the mission we're going to talk about this evening. Thanks for coming. I hope this is part of an ongoing relationship with the museum. Let me kind of frame this evening's event, though. 80 years ago tonight was the signing by Alfred Jodl, the Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces High Command Operations Group, of the document, the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters. So 80 years ago tonight was the instrument that ends the war in Europe, nearly 6 years of war. And then President Truman will declare the next day, the 8th, VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. That's where it comes from. Certainly, now, of course, the Soviets, they had their own deal. They wanted another ceremony, and so there was another one signed in Berlin the next day, and they will celebrate the end of the war on the 9th. So you may hear some of this out there. But for us, Victory in Europe is the 8th of May, and with good cause. Now, if we think about that piece, what we're going to talk about tonight is the last major bombing raid of the war, and it's against Hitler's hometown of Linz, Austria. And we have tonight Mike Croissant with us. He'll discuss his recent title, Bombing Hitler's Hometown, the Untold Story, the Last Mass Bomber Raid of World War II in Europe. Now, why is that exciting? You know, this is going to happen on the 25th of April, 1945. And then, as those of you who've seen Liberation on the first floor, Hitler had grand designs for his hometown. There was going to be this monumental art museum when he won the war with all the looted treasures from Europe and from the victims of the Holocaust, where he would have that. And so I think it's fitting that, you know, not only is the raid on his hometown to dash those dreams, but soon afterwards he'll commit suicide and end the 1,000-year Reich that was a misguided dream. But, you know, so VE Day is really powerful. It's also important in the idea, central to our strategic thinking was this idea that Germany was the most dangerous of the Axis enemies. You had to defeat Germany first. If you defeated Italy but not Germany, there's still a war. If you could knock Germany out of the war, things were possible. And so this really is a decisive moment in the war. That's not to downplay the fact that there's a lot of heavy fighting still in the Pacific. You know, Okinawa's going on. Operations are planned for the downfall of Japan. So certainly not quite total victory, but an incredible victory along the way, and certainly, you know, enabled, won, fought for, sacrificed by Americans, and we should be proud of that. Now, Mike's an intelligence and foreign affairs expert. He's an author, retired CIA officer. His career in the CIA spanned more than 2 decades as an analyst and a counterterrorism targeting officer. So this is pretty exciting tonight. He actually gets to be not in a little windowless cube, but in a building with people and windows, and he gets to talk to other people. So pretty amazing. He served in Washington, Middle East, Central South Asia, and as I understand it, most recently in Houston, where he settled. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science and history from the University of Illinois, a master's in Central Eurasian Studies from Indiana University, and also in defense and strategic studies from Missouri State. As I mentioned, he and his family live near Houston. So great to have you back here. As he said, you know, it's been since 2014, and as many of you know, the museum has continued to grow and expand to really meet all the aspects of our mission, why the war is fought, how it's won, and what it means today as we've continued this. Now, in our conversation with Mike this evening is a member of our own team, Dr. Sean Scanlon. Sean's a World War II historian at the Institute. He's a Western Massachusetts native, so you'll detect a little dialect there, you know. But his PhD is from the University of Nebraska, and his research is focused on American foreign policy, in addition to all the tasks we give him at the Institute, ranging from teaching master's degrees all the way to individual research and writing. Before joining our museum team last summer, Sean was a visiting professor at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts and at the University of Mississippi. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sean Scanlon and Mike Croissant to the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much, Mike, for that introduction. I feel like compelled to say that I'm wicked excited to be here with you this evening.
I compelled him.
Mike, thanks so much for being here. Thanks for coming. Thanks for writing this book. I'd love it if you could just give us a real quick sort of elevator pitch description of what the book's about.
The book is about the last mass bomber raid of World War II in Europe. And what do I mean by that? Well, in April of 1945, the German Reich the noose was closing around it. It was shrinking, and frankly, the 2 American strategic air forces were running out of targets. Vienna had just fallen a couple of weeks before, and Linz, Austria was left as the last major rail center in the shrinking German Reich. so the Germans could use the rail system there to shift supplies north and south and east and west. In the middle part of April, a photo reconnaissance mission over Linz detected not only that the rail system was functioning, but the storage areas were full of 2,000 rail cars full of potential stuff to keep the war going. And that couldn't stand. So the 15th Air Force, which is the other Air Force, you always hear about the 8th based in England. The 15th is the Italy-based Air Force. They were sent on April the 25th of 1945 to take care of that problem once and for all. That's what the book is about. It's about the last mission, and it's about the men and what happened to them. A great many of them suffered that day and for many years to come. And it's about how they got home and how they dealt with all of the baggage that came with what happened to them that day.
Well, thank you. I want to get into the meat of the whole raid in a moment. But since Mike mentioned your former career earlier, I'd love to hear if your sort of experience in the intelligence world sort of shaped how you approached the subject, and maybe just a little bit about what your research process, what were the archives you went to, and some of the people you talked to.
Sure. Did I lose the? Can you hear me? No? Oh, there we go.
There we go.
My background as an analyst at the CIA absolutely affected how this unfolded. A CIA analyst is charged with, in a nutshell, taking information from all different sources and trying to assemble it into a picture that we can inform American policymakers about something that's happening in the world. I approached this task in the same way. And as with being a CIA officer, when you're formulating this, think of it as a jigsaw puzzle with not all the pieces that you need. You don't even know what the picture's supposed to look like. You just have pieces and you have to put them together to figure out what the story is. That's absolutely what happened with this. This story began with a quest to find out about my uncle, his life and his death. That gave me part of the picture, and then as I was doing more and more research, all of this came together, and this beautiful mosaic of a photo, of a picture, came to life. In terms of research, fortunately I live near the National Archives, so I made many trips up there, and most importantly, I reached out to many, many veterans. I started this in 2011, 2012. And I interviewed about 55 men. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. These men were in their late 80s and early 90s at the time, and we'll hopefully talk about this later, but many of them had never spoken about this day. And when I reached out to them, most were at a place in their lives where they were willing to start sharing. And I was the great beneficiary of that, and now you all are too.
So you bring up a really important point. Is one that I'm kind of dealing with in my own research, is that at the sort of at this point when I'm starting, there are very few, if any, veterans that I can actually interview. But since you started this process over a decade ago, you had lots of people who you could talk to and who were willing to hear your stories. And I think here at the World War II Museum, that's something we deal with pretty regularly, is that we have these events where we bring veterans to the museum, sometimes on their birthday, sing happy birthday. It's a very sort of powerful and moving experience, but it's increasingly rare. So you were sort of very fortunate that you started your research when you did.
Very fortunate, and I became very close with a handful. Many of the interviews were just one and done because it was just too much pain to talk about in depth, but a handful I became very close with, and unfortunately, the last surviving man that I consider in that close circle passed just before the book came out. He didn't quite make it to the finish line with me, but missed them all. Mm-hmm. They enriched my life in ways that I can't even describe.
I can imagine. So one of the things you do, I think, very well in the book is you give us a sort of a wide range of people. You talk about a lot of individual people's different experiences. But I'd love it if you could talk some more about some of the very specific people. And you mentioned a very close family connection. Could you tell us a little bit about Ellsworth Croissant?
Ellsworth Croissant was my uncle. He was very young, as they all were. He initially started in the Army Medical Corps, and he felt like he wasn't doing enough for the war effort, so he joined the Air Forces and became a bombardier, and quite a good one, as I understand it. He went through the war without a scratch, 21 combat missions. His crew flew home, and he was essentially running out the clock until he could be discharged. He was going to go to the University of Illinois to study agriculture. I would like to think that he wanted to become a farmer and live the rest of his life in peace. He didn't make it. He got an opportunity on very short notice to hop on a plane from where he was stationed in South Dakota, fly to Wisconsin, and then take a train to where my family is from in Illinois. It's a long story, but the plane crashed and all aboard were killed. He was 22 years old. Learning about his life and his death opened up the story to me. As I was studying his letters that were gifted to me and many, many other things, I stumbled upon the story. And it was very emotional. I went to his grave in 2012 and promised him that I would tell a story. And looking back, that was a foolish promise for a man to make, because I would have had a hard time writing 5 pages about him. I just didn't know him at all. I went back last year to his grave and laid a copy of the book and had a moment with my uncle. But he's the reason we're here. He opened up this window, and now we're all aware of this great story.
Did any of the people that you talked to for your research remember your uncle?
I did connect with his navigator, who just so happened to be his best friend, and I became very good friends with him the last few years of his life. My uncle came across to me through the years, through the letters, through the interviews, as a happy-go-lucky guy. Didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't gamble. Just a pleasant young man, and taken from us way too early, like so many others were.
So I love that we can sort of personalize the war. It's one thing to talk about 16 million Americans serving or 400-something Americans dying in the war, but to put names to those numbers, I think, is really powerful. And so there's a couple of other ones I want to talk to you about. One of them that I think very few people will know unless they're from New Orleans, but Jack Langsfield is another person to talk about. Could you talk us a little bit about
He was a waist gunner on a B-17, 483rd Bomb Group. He was on the famous mission to Berlin, the one and only 15th Air Force mission to Berlin. He very nearly died on April the 25th, as far too many men did that day, but he survived. He came back. His pilot was grievously wounded, but they made it. And he grew up here. He died here a couple of years ago, I think 2020, at age 94. And there were many moments in doing this that really chilled me to the bone, to be honest. And one was with Jack. We were having lunch in the rib room over at one of the hotels, and as an aspiring author, an author always has to have something to write on in case you have an idea. So I took out a pen and I had a paper napkin, and we were talking about flak. Flak is the abbreviation for a German word that I won't attempt to say, but it would come out of this gun here, this 88 millimeter gun. These cannon shells would explode and send shrapnel in all directions, and the men called it flak. So we were talking about flak, and one of the things that was really distinctive about the Linz mission was the obscene amount of flak that day. There were 168 of these guns defending Linz, which was way more than there had been earlier in the war, and the men were absolutely shot to pieces. So I'm talking to Jack about flak, And I had this paper napkin, and I wrote a couple of X's, just a few. I said, so if this is light flak, then I drew a few more, and this is medium flak. What was it like that day? And I will never forget the look on his face. There was a wooden column next to him that was painted solid black, and he just goes like this. The meaning was the Germans shot so much flak into the sky that the sky turned black. And the look on his face was as if he were there. It gives me goosebumps. I lost touch with Jack, and he passed a few years ago, but a great citizen of the city. He was the CEO of Linz Brothers, which was a packaging company here in the city.
Talked a lot about some names that are really only known to the families of these veterans, but there's a couple of fairly famous names that pop up in your book. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the names that people would
We have a
more
few
likely
you might
recognize?
Yeah, George McGovern, the presidential candidate in 1972, was pilot, 455th Bomb Group. It was his last mission. At this point in the war, if you could go up into enemy territory and come back 35 times, you got to go home. And this was number 35 for him. Sometimes they would get a warning the night before where they were going next, and he was warned that you're going to Linz. Everybody knew that Linz was a terrible, very highly defended target. So he approached his crew, and he gave them the option to sit it out because he knew what was about to happen. And they voted unanimously to go together. They went up and they were shot to pieces, more than 100 holes in the aircraft. They lost hydraulic power, so they had to land they had to stop their aircraft when they landed by throwing parachutes out the waist windows to slow it down. The experience shattered the flight engineer, and he had to be hospitalized. It was just the most brutal experience you can imagine that day. So that's George McGovern. They all survived. I spoke to one of the men, Bill Ashlock. He was wounded that day. Another one, Norman Lear, you may know from television and movies. He was on the mission. He was a radio operator on a B-17, 33rd mission, as I recall. Same story. The aircraft was filled with holes from front to back, but they all survived.
So now we've talked about sort of the individuals going on the raid, but I wonder, and I think you do this very well in the book, so I'm wondering if you could sort of share with us, what is the sort of step-by-step experience like for these airmen? Because I think you chart very well in the book how they're going to the intelligence briefing and the weather briefing, and then preparing the aircraft, and then boarding and taking off and flying to the target. Could you sort of walk us through what an airman, a gunner, a navigator might have experienced in the run-up to the actual raid itself?
Sure. They were given a lot of information very early in the morning. What the target is, how they would get there, what kind of resistance they were likely to face. And I talked to several men who remembered that specific day because they were told just how heavily defended they expected the intelligence officers expected the target to be. We're talking half again as many of these guns were defending that city as the last time they had been there. Some of the men left the briefing to go be ill because it was just that impactful to them. There was a lot of cursing, as I understand it. Some of the men that I spoke to didn't know what Linz was, didn't know what going there entailed, so they were like, what is all this fuss about? But anyway, there's the briefing, the weather, then they eat breakfast, they board trucks and go out to the flight line and start putting on their gear. These aircraft, B-17 and B-24 bombers, are not pressurized and not heated. And when you're flying 5 miles above the earth, that is not pleasant to go through. The temperature is way below zero, 50, 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. There's not enough oxygen to breathe, so you have multiple layers of clothing on, including a layer that has electric filaments inside that distributes heat through your body. and you wear an oxygen mask above 10,000 feet. So literally, before even getting to the target, these men's lives were in danger just by being in the air in that state. Fortunately, the German Air Force had largely been grounded, so they did not face that enemy. They faced the elements, and when they got to Linz, they faced that horrible cloud of exploding metal. It was not pleasant to go through this. If your skin was exposed, you would get frostbite within a few minutes. If your oxygen regulator, your oxygen mask froze, which they did, you could pass out and die within minutes. If you touched your skin to metal, you would lose a lot of that skin because of the cold. So we're talking about an environment that is completely foreign to any of us. I flew here yesterday in comfort, and I was reflecting on that, what it must have been like. So the men board the aircraft around 8 a.m., as I recall, and form up into formations and head for Linz. And the bombing begins about noon and ends about 2 o'clock. We're talking about 500 plus bombers. That's a lot of bombers, and this would never happen again in the annals of warfare. So the last time over the continent of Europe was that day, April the 25th, 1945, that there would be this massive wave of bombers and 200 escort fighters. So it was a date that was deadly to many on the ground and in the air, and was almost forgotten. But thankfully, the men shared it with me, shared things with me, and luckily I was stubborn enough to not let this thing die, and I went out and got all the information needed to tell the story.
I can imagine another thing that would have been on these men's minds as they're flying toward the target, in addition to making sure their instruments are right, making sure they're going in the right direction, whatever, is that this is last week of April 1945. We know that the war is going to be over in less than 2 weeks, but these folks didn't
know that, yeah.
But they must have had some sense that the end was near.
They did.
Did any of them talk about that feeling, that sense?
Yeah, the prevailing sentiment for those who knew what to expect over Linz was, you got to be kidding me, it's almost over, why are we doing this? But they had no choice. They just did what they were told.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk more about the raid itself. When the bombers arrive over time, well, can you just walk us through the steps? Because they're coming at different times in different waves. This is all coordinated and scheduled. Who arrives first, and what do they experience?
The 15th Air Force is mostly a B-24 organization. There are some B-17s, but it's weighted very heavily on the side of the B-24s. B-24s led the initial wave, the 304th Bomb Wing. My uncle was up toward the front. He was the lead navigator for his squadron. The first aircraft was shot down in the first 4 minutes. Just imagine that. 4 minutes is how long it took. And I have a photo of it. There's a photo in the book. One of the only pictures taken from the air of a bomber going down is that one, the first bomber. Thankfully, all the men survived. But it was just brutal. Like, bomber after bomber was hit and would go down. We would ultimately lose 15. But these men they're flying in formations of 6 ships, staggered in 3 dimensions, so they can defend each other with their machine guns. So it's a very carefully choreographed dance, if you will, and it's down to the minute in planning when they would be there and at what height and everything else. And the Germans had a say, and the Germans did their very best to knock as many planes out of the sky as possible. And in far too many instances, they succeeded.
So you said the 15th is predominantly B-24s, but there are B-17s taking part in the raid as well, right?
They come up, they bring up the rear, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They're flying a little higher, so this gun is not doesn't have the range to hit them, so they're facing 105 millimeter guns, which is even more deadly. And they had a really rough time.
So maybe if you could have us to sort of put your historical targeting hat on for a moment. What are they trying to hit? What are the sort of very specific targets that they're aiming for?
So let's go back in time. Let's talk about Linz first. Linz, so the third largest city in Austria then and today. And Hitler moved there with his family when he was 9 years old, and he would spend the next 9 or 10 years living in or near Linz. He quickly grew attached to the city. He was really drawn by the ethnic German nationalist fervor in the city, and in particular in his classroom in middle school, He loved the city, the architecture for the most part, but there were parts of it that he didn't like. So he was kind of a deadbeat student, so he would spend a lot of time walking around with a sketchbook and drawing things. And one of the things that he would draw was what he would do to Linz if he had the opportunity. So fast forward, he's now the dictator of Nazi Germany, March 1938. The first place he goes after visiting his parents' graves in Austria is Linz. And on the main square there, he gets out and addresses the crowd from a balcony that's still there, untouched, and gives a rousing address. The crowd goes nuts, and he decides, based on the response, to annex Austria. So history is changed by the response of a crowd in a small city in rural Austria. So yesterday's dreamer is now today's dictator who can bring his dreams and make them reality. So he commissions a study to begin building these things that he had envisioned. One of them was the art museum that Dr. Bell answered, that he would be buried there with his parents, many other things. There are models and drawings of it. But in order to pay for that, he had to industrialize the city to raise tax revenue. So a large industrial plant was built. The entire eastern side of the city, even today, is an industrial center. And with that, the large rail system was expanded further. As the war dragged on, the Germans began producing armaments in that industrial center. So between the rail system and the industry, that made it a military target. So the 15th Air Force bombed it 21 times, was not successful until the final time. It was just, bombing wasn't, they called it precision bombing. It was nothing of the sort. They had a heck of a time because Linz was so well defended. And it took right up until the very end to finally put it out of commission. And the question was, I'm sorry, that was the backstory. What was the question?
What are the very specific sites that the bombers are trying to hit?
Right, yeah. The Linz rail system was, there were 4 targets. There was the rail station, storage area, and then the 2 main north and south rail yards. That was it. And they assigned a number of different bomb groups to hit each one. And there's a photo in the book of what that looked like afterwards. For whatever reason, that day we were very successful. We bombed the absolute daylights out of that rail system. And when Patton's army entered the city on May 5th, almost without a shot fired, there's a photo of it in the book of what the rail system looked like once we got done with it. It was, as the dad of someone in the audience here who's very dear to me said, he told me, we put that thing out of commission. Yeah, they did a number on it.
So I think another thing you do very well in the book, and that I think is very, very interesting and useful for us as readers to get, is you try and tell the story of the raid from both sides. So obviously you've talked to a lot of airmen who were flying over Linz that day, but you also talked to folks on the ground. You also talked to German and Austrian civilians and soldiers. Could you talk a little bit? So first, I'd be very curious. How did you make those contacts, and what did they tell you?
I felt like I had a pretty good handle on the American side of the story by about 2015-16. And I would continue to add to that for another almost 10 years. But I had gone to Linz in 2012, loved it. It was a beautiful city, but it was a really short trip, and it just ate away at me that there's a whole another side to the story, and I've got to make an effort at least to capture some of it. So the first step was to find Austrian women from Linz who married American GIs. The United States occupied Linz after the war for 10 years, so it's inevitable that Austrian women would marry GIs. I found a couple of those and spoke to them. And then I went again in 2019, just before COVID, and toured a bomb shelter. I toured all of the Hitler sites, and then I met with probably half a dozen people who, as children, were bombed by our fathers. And they told me about it, and they didn't know what the heck was going on. What is a war? Why is this happening to us? And they described life on the edge. And none of them held a grudge toward us. Their attitude was, it's war. Didn't know what it was at the time, but I do now, and I understand that the Americans were just doing what they were told, and the outcome for the Austrians was quite good. So I spoke to several people who were under the bombs, and interestingly, on the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II in Europe, I spoke with a member of the Hitler Youth. He didn't join because he wanted to, he joined because they made him, and he was manning one of those guns. His entire high school class was forced out of school and made to man 88 millimeter guns outside of Linz. So in his living room in rural Austria, 75 years after the fact, it was amazing to be talking to this man, and charming individual. He just passed a year or so ago, unfortunately, but many moments like that in this process where I just felt like I had to pinch myself. But the Austrian perspective is an important one. It's something I felt I had to take a stab at, and you can judge for yourselves if I did an adequate job. But just wanted to give a touch for how it felt. And by the way, the book, I know some of you have read it, many of you probably have not, but the book is written to make you feel like you're there. I didn't want to write a dry thing that would put you to sleep in the first half hour. Maybe it'll do that anyway, I hope not. But I wanted you to feel like you were there. You know, I was never in combat. I didn't know what I was describing, but I wanted to come as close to getting it right as possible. So I studied, I read, I went super nerd. I studied technical manuals of the bombers. I went on a ride in a B-24. I climbed all over a B-17. And I studied other memoirs and other sources. So when I would talk to these men, I would do it from a position of knowledge. So they would understand that I respected them enough to dig deeply and be a super nerd and try to understand what it was like, and then they would tell me what it was like. So the book is written as if you're there, as if you're experiencing it, as if you're smelling the smells and seeing the sights. It's not going to be easy. There are parts in particular when we get to the later half of the book where we get into how the Soviets treated one of the Americans, that it gets pretty dicey. There's a concentration camp liberation scene, and some of the sons and daughters of that crew are here. So it's not light reading, but hopefully you'll find it enlightening and entertaining and feel as much as possible, having not been there, what it was like.
So another piece I'm interested to hear you talk about is the ride back from the raid, because I mean, as you've attested to, there's intense flak. A lot of these a lot of bombers are shot down, but even those that aren't are probably pretty badly damaged. I think there's some really harrowing scenes in the book of bombers trying to return to base. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. There were bomb groups that suffered 90+% of their aircraft damaged, mostly severely. 28 Americans lost their lives, 15 aircraft were shot down. That's a steep butcher's bill when the war has 13 days left to go. The men who were struggling to get home faced incredible challenges. Oftentimes, these aircraft lost hydraulics or lost their flight controls. One man I spoke to, they literally patched together the autopilot so they could continue to keep the aircraft airborne. And by the time they got close to base, they switched autopilot off, and he moved the control wheels, and the aircraft actually responded. They didn't know if they were going to get back. Just things like that are incredible to think about. You know, I mentioned McGovern's crew having to throw parachutes out the waist windows to stop the airplane. That happened a lot that day. And then you have the men who didn't make it. They parachuted out or crash landed. There were a lot of those. Believe it or not, of the 15 aircraft that experienced that, I have firsthand accounts from every single one. And I interviewed living survivors on the majority, which is remarkable. You know, when I started, I think it was 68 years after the fact. So I put you right on board these aircraft as they're being shot to pieces, and as the men are struggling to get out. There's some funny scenes, certain men, you know, slipping and sliding out of the airplane, others jumping out wounded. It was truly incredible, and it was a pleasure, it was a privilege to do this.
So I want to ask you more about the experiences of the down flyers, because there's a couple of different sort of experiences that they could have. Several of them are captured. Some of them are, well, I was about to say fortunate, but maybe not so fortunate to fall into Soviet hands. Would you talk a little bit about the experience of down flyers?
The experience was entirely based on who captured you or who took you into custody when you got to the ground. There's, I'd say, probably 4 different experiences to offer. One was the Volkssturm. This was the body that Hitler formed in the closing months of the war. It was essentially boys who were too young to serve, or old men, or people who were recovering from wounds. So they were given rifles and an armband, and they would go out when an aircraft was shot down, and they would bring in all of the men who parachuted out. They behaved pretty well overall towards our men. The other option would be to be captured by the Germans. The Germans overall behaved properly. They behaved honorably in most cases, properly, not often well, but they abided by their obligations under the Geneva, by the rules of war, for the most part. Third option was to fall into Soviet custody. The Soviets were our allies. I say quote-unquote allies because of what I'm about to say, but the Soviets were advancing from the east and had already taken Vienna, so the men didn't have far to go to land in Soviet territory if their bomber was too damaged to make it home. So quite a few crews in the book, including a family member who are here today, landed in Soviet territory. And the Soviets took them in, and as our allies, they were obligated to return our men to American custody. Some of the fun, I don't know if I should say funniest, it's not really that funny, but kind of comical misadventures the men get into in the book are with the Soviets, because there's a lot of vodka involved, of course, because they're Russians, and they do all kinds of hijinks, and it's entertaining. But in one case, the Soviets behaved barbarically, and that's the case of Dale Shabilsky. Dale was a young man of Polish extraction from Omaha, Nebraska, 20 years old. He's on his 33rd mission, so he can see the finish line. He's at the radio table of a B-24 that is absolutely devastated. One of his jobs as a radio operator is, once the bombs are dropped, he's to look back toward the bomb bay to verify visually that all the bombs have actually fallen out. As he does that, a puff of smoke blows into the bomb bay, followed immediately by a shock wave, and he's blown off his feet. He gathers his senses and goes to brush away what he thinks is sweat from above his right eye, and his glove comes back red. He's been shot in the head by flak. Not severely, but he's bleeding. He's also been shot in the behind as well. One other man is wounded. They make a crash landing in Soviet-occupied Hungary, and fortunately, friendly Hungarians rush at the aircraft, and they take the uninjured men away. They take the injured tail gunner in another direction, and they take Dale in yet another. Well, they give him medical care, and then they tell him to get rid of his American uniform and his ID papers, which is bad advice. And they walk to Budapest. And there, Dale gives himself up to a Soviet patrol, and they see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned young man, and they accuse him of being a German spy and proceed to torture him brutally for several days before finally returning him to American military control. Dale's tale is told exclusively in the book. He's talked about it a little. It's out there on the internet, but I was given the whole story and tell it for the first time. It will sicken you, it will enrage you, and it will make you understand the conflict in Ukraine much better than you might without having read it. The Russians have not changed at all. Dale made it back. He buried his memories, as many of the men did, but the loving intervention of his daughter convinced him to start talking, and he did. And he wrote a memoir that I was given access to. And a great honor of mine was to tell his story. He passed in 2014, just after I spoke with him, age 89. I think he found peace. Peace in telling the story.
So you alluded to a concentration camp earlier, and that
Yeah.
concentration camp is Mauthausen. One of the Americans ends up there, doesn't he?
The last bomber to go down on this day was under the command of Robert Sinton, and they bailed out right above Mauthausen. Every one of them is shot at by men with rifles on the ground, which is a war crime, by the way. And they all those who lived landed in or near the camp. One man was deceased on board the aircraft, the co-pilot. A second man, his parachute partially unfurled aboard. He jumped and it failed to deploy. He fell to his death. And a third man was murdered in his parachute. A bullet struck him under the chin and exited through his head. Those who lived were taken inside the camp, and the deputy camp commandant, whose name I will not speak, came, lined them up against the wall, and slapped and spat upon them, called them names for well over an hour. Eventually, the bodies of the deceased that were recovered were brought in, and they were cremated in the ovens. The men would be there for a few days before they were shipped on to another camp, and they all survived. I spoke to one of them personally.
Well, I think one of the pieces of your book that I was most interested in towards the end is something that happens after the war. So I guess we should fill in the gap before we get there. That the raid ends in the afternoon. 2 weeks later, the war is over, and there's a lot of celebrating, but also some conflicted feelings among some of the men. Right? How did they greet the end of the war?
I go into great detail about how the war affected them because I felt, becoming so close to several of the men and learning how deeply it affected them, it really moved my heart. The mission was so brutal that the memories were extremely vivid. And I'll give you one example. A navigator on a B-17 named Ken Becker was the navigator's navigator. He loved the art and science of navigation. He told me that despite all these windows up in the front of his aircraft, he never took the opportunity to stand up and look outside while over a target. He said, but Mike, that day, I knew the war was coming to an end soon. I decided I was going to look out on this day in this mission. He said, I saw black smoke, I saw brown smoke, and I saw white smoke. I didn't know what that meant, but it scared the hell out of me. Excuse my language. So, not long after, I'm sitting in the National Archives, and I find a photo from his group, his squadron, from that day. And how many types of smoke do you think there were? Black, brown, and white. That was how vivid this was. It was burned into their memories. Now, the men dealt with that in a couple of different ways. The two extremes were the veteran was pretty open and talked about it. That was very rare in my experience. The other extreme was they completely locked those memories away and never talked about it. That was the majority of the men that I spoke with. And then there were some in the middle who would talk to their kids about some of the more vanilla, aspects of service. So interviewing these men who were on the spectrum of never having talked about it was a very delicate thing. And I approached it with great empathy and understanding, and walked them through the recovery process, frankly, together. We walked it together. And I think in particular of Hal Millett from Dayton, Ohio. Hal was deeply affected by this mission. And by the way, if you came home from this mission, you were not the same man anymore. You were not the same person. It was unimaginable for anyone who wasn't there. They were changed by it. And Hal was right up there among them. He had PTSD so badly that he decided to take all of his memories of the war and lock them away. He was a computer guy, so he described it to me as putting files on a hard drive in a section where it couldn't easily be accessed. He went so far as forgetting the names of his crewmates, his brothers, or where they were from, or what combat was like, what Italy was like. He just locked it all away. He didn't throw away the key, but he came pretty close. Again, he had a daughter who loved him and encouraged him to tell the story, and he opened that door. He described it as the door of a vault at Fort Knox, and it took a lot of effort to pry that thing open. I spent hours with Hal in person and on the phone, and the last time I was with him was in his office in Florida, and this was a shattered man. And I was just trying to help him realize, at one point I said, Hal, you saved the world, right? And he said, yeah. And he did talk. He talked to me, he talked to others, and he gets a lot of pages in the book. He would pass a couple of years later, and I'm glad to say that I was on his speed dial apparently when he was in the final days of his life. He called me, and I spoke to him, and I think it was hospice care. And when I picked up, I think I could tell he was still talking to someone before he realized I had picked up. And I want to say that he was regaling the nurses there with tales of the war. I could just hear him, and he was happy. And that filled me with peace to know that he had found peace. So, the book, the most excruciating parts of the book for me, to read even now, having written them, and to listen on the audiobook, is this part where the men are trying to get over the war and how each of them dealt with it. Something that really impacted them negatively after combat was they were given the opportunity to fly at low level over the targets that they bombed. So rather than being 5 miles above the earth where you can't really see what damage is being done, you're flying at a couple thousand feet, and you can see the ruins that they have made. And this devastated Hal, it devastated Norman Lear, and was very, very rough, and was part of the reason why they just stopped talking about it.
Well, Mike, one more question I have is that, so you talked about the veterans who came home, many of which you were able to talk to, but there are a whole bunch of Americans from the raid who don't come home, and whose remains, in fact, remain on the ground in Austria around Linz. So one of your final chapters is about the efforts of the Army's Graves Registration Service to recover their bodies, and it's a mission very near and dear to us here at the World War II Museum, as a recovery of the remains of American soldiers. Could you talk a little bit about graves registration and efforts to recover bodies after the war?
These men are and women are the unsung heroes of the book, no doubt about it. The Graves Registration Service would go out to areas where Americans were suspected of having fallen and interview people from the time it happened to try to figure out and review records as well and try to figure out where our fallen were laid to rest. In the case of the book, Austria is divided between the Soviets and the Americans. Linz is in the American zone, but the other side of the river is the Soviet zone. The Soviets do not cooperate because they're Soviets. They stonewalled us at every turn, but our men were so dedicated to not leaving anyone behind that they persuaded their way into the Soviet zone, including Mauthausen, to try to piece together what happened to these men. And I'm fortunate, I'm thankful to say that as of 2025, one person's remains are unlocated from this raid. His name is in the book. The rest were recovered. And in some of these cases, there were not enough remains left to positively identify a person. So a couple of the crews are buried together as brothers, whatever remains are there. There's some in St. Louis, there's some in other places. I love so much about this country, and those people willing to go out and not let an American be left behind, I think is incredibly honorable. And again, unsung heroes in the book.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. If we could just give a hand to Mike Croissant. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will come bring the microphone to you. Our first question will be in the front to your right.
With all the research you did here, especially personal one-on-one type interviews that were so in-depth, I'm wondering how much has that changed your outlook on life and your how you look at war now?
I will look back on the 12 years that this took me to bring to fruition as some of the best years of my life. These men made me a better man. They made me a better American. What they did is hard to put into words. They saved the world and then asked almost nothing in return. What other country does that but this one? When the book came out, I felt a certain vacuum in my life because I didn't have this. I poured my heart into this for so many years. I had other things going on. I had a day job hunting terrorists and other things. So I had stuff going on in my life. I had 3 small children. So, but it was worth every minute. It was worth every minute. The story is now told. It was so close to being lost. And I know there's people watching, maybe people here who are veterans, who haven't told their story. Please tell your story. You may be thinking, and this is what my dad told me, he was in the war as well. He told me, well, nobody cares. Or he would also say, I didn't do anything important. No, I don't accept that. What every serviceman and woman does matters. Their children and their grandchildren need to know what they did for us. Americans need to know what they did for us. So if you have a story, if you don't think you have a story, you do. Start writing it down. Do whatever you have to do. Paint, write poetry, whatever you have to do. Open the door, start telling the story. Find a guy like me who will listen. Tell it to a loved one, but tell it. Don't take your story to the grave with you, please.
Amen.
Next question will be in the middle.
Mike, you mentioned the artillery to your left was a 84 millimeter. Do you know what height those were good to shoot at?
I hope I didn't say 84, it's 88. I hope that-
Sorry.
Okay, no.
And then the follow-up was, you also mentioned the 105 millimeter artillery was up higher. Do you know what the two different heights were?
The B-24s, which were the main targets of this gun, came in at between 23 and 25,000 feet that day, well within the range of this one. I am a nerd, but I'm not nerdy enough to tell you the exact range of these weapons, but the 105 could reach the B-17s. The B-17s were coming in quite a bit higher. They were up about 30,000 feet, and that's a bigger shell, so they wreaked a lot more damage than this one.
Next question, we're over to the side.
We cheated and looked at the text panel, 26,000 feet. After reading your book, do you have any recommendations on any first-person accounts, any of the books you read that maybe of veterans that you weren't able to interview because they passed? Is there an eyewitness account, of course, after buying the book here, reading it, and then going out to get another one?
You really put me on the spot. Oh, boy. I would be hard-pressed to name one. I know the pilot of the Memphis Belle wrote a memoir. Norman Lear did. McGovern did. Those are all well worth the read.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Croissant and Dr. Sean Scanlon.
Thank you.
Don't wait yet.
Oh.
Just wait. So I want to thank Mike for being here tonight to not only share his work with us, but really the stories of an amazing young Americans that will burn in our memories. That 80 years ago, as he said, young Americans who saved the world. And I think it's important that we not forget their service, their sacrifice. Wasn't easy. There's a lot of pain and sacrifice along the way, and I think sometimes it sounds like you do a great job. We're not glorifying the war, but we're appreciating what it took to win that. If you think of the challenges, you had to break up the German war-making machine, liberate the oppressed peoples, and then set the conditions for a post-war world of freedom and security, and that was no small task. And in retrospect, we know when the Germans gave up, 80 years ago tonight, but you never really do know when the war is going to end. And our enemies have proved incredibly resilient, unfortunately, for those who suffered in those last few weeks of the war. Now, Mike will be signing books tonight. There's a table back to y'all's left. Notice the sign says author book signing. That's where he'll be. You better be there. I'd invite people, if you get books, great. We've got them on sale back here. But also join us across the street at the Higgins Hotel at Kilroy's Bar. Kilroy's will be offering extended happy hour this evening until 9 p.m. Just in honor of this event and Mike's book. So we hope to see you all there. Now, what's ahead? Please mark your calendars. We have some upcoming Jenny Craig Institute programs. Next Wednesday, May 14th, we have Robert Edsel. Robert Edsel, you may know from the Monuments Men and Women. He'll be presenting on his latest book. It's called Remember Us, American Sacrifice, Dutch Freedom, and a Forever Promise Forged in World War II. So next Wednesday, Robert Edsel. And then on June 5th, we'll kick off the museum's 25th birthday festivities, listening to our President and CEO Emeritus, Dr. Nick Mueller, he will launch his upcoming book, Preserving the Legacy, Creating the National World War II Museum. So this thing didn't just happen. It really required someone with vision and drive to bring it to life. And Dr. Mueller has spent the last few years going through all the history, spanning more than 30 years to bring this creation, the creation of this institution to the record, tell that story, if you will, before it's forgotten. And I think there's inspiration in there, as Mike suggested, the legacy of these young Americans who saved the world is an important thing for us to honor their service and sacrifice. So on that happy note, join me in another round of applause for Mike and Sean. And thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again soon. Thanks for coming. Now you can.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.